Chapter 1 of What Katy Did at School. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Karen Savage, Waco, Texas, May 2007. What Katy Did at School by Susan Coolidge. Chapter 1. Conic's Section. It was just after that happy visit of which I told at the end of What Katy Did that Elsie and John made their famous excursion to Conic's section, an excursion which neither of them ever forgot, and about which the family teased them for a long time afterward. The summer had been cool, but, as often happens after cool summers, the autumn proved unusually hot. It seemed as if the months had been playing a game and had changed places all round, and as if September were determined to show that he knew how to make himself just as disagreeable as August, if only he chose to do so. All the last half of Cousin Helen's stay the weather was excessively sultry. She felt it very much, though the children did all they could to make her comfortable, with shaded rooms and iced water and fans. Every evening the boys would wheel her sofa out on the porch in hopes of coolness, but it was of no use. The evenings were as warm as the days, and the yellow dust hanging in the air made the sunshine look thick and hot. A few bright leaves appeared on the trees, but they were wrinkled and of an ugly color. Clover said she thought they had been boiled red like lobsters. Altogether, the month was a trying one, and the coming of October made little difference. Still the dust continued, and the heat, and the wind when it blew had no refreshment in it, but seemed to have passed over some great furnace which had burned out of it all life and flavor. In spite of this, however, it was wonderful to see how Katy gained and improved. Every day added to her powers. First she came down to dinner, then to breakfast. She sat on the porch in the afternoons. She poured the tea. It was like a miracle to the others in the beginning to watch her going about the house. But they got used to it surprisingly soon. One does to pleasant things. One person, however, never got used to it, never took it as a matter of course, and that was Katy herself. She could not run downstairs or out into the garden. She could not open the kitchen door to give an order without a sense of gladness and exultation which was beyond words. The wider and more active life stimulated her in every way. Her cheeks grew round and pink, her eyes bright. Cousin Helen and Papa watched this change with indescribable pleasure, and Mrs. Worrett, who dropped in to lunch one day, fairly screamed with surprise at the sight of it. "To think of it!" she cried. "Why, the last time I was here you looked as if you had took root in that chair of yours for the rest of your days, and here you are stepping around as lively as I be. Well, well, wonders will never cease. It does my eyes good to see you, Catherine. I wish your poor aunt were here today, that I do. How pleased she'd be." It is doubtful whether Aunt Izzie would have been so pleased, for the lived-in look of the best parlour would have horrified her extremely, but Katy did not recollect that just then. She was touched at the genuine kindness of Mrs. Worrett's voice, and took very willingly her offered kiss. Clover brought lemonade and grapes, and they all devoted themselves to making the poor lady comfortable. Just before she went away she said, "How is it that I can't never get any of you to come out to Conic's section? I'm sure I've asked you often enough. There's Elsie now, and John. They're just the age to enjoy being in the country. Why won't you send 'em out for a week? Johnny can feed the chickens and chase 'em too if she likes," she added, as Johnny dashed just then into view pursuing one of Phil's bantams round the house. "Tell her so, won't you, Catherine? There's lots of chickens on the farm. She can chase them from morning to night if she's a mind to." Katy thanked her, but she didn't think the children would care to go. She gave Johnny the message, and then the whole matter passed out of her mind. The family were in low spirits that morning because of Cousin Helen's having just gone away, and Elsie was lying on the sofa fanning herself with a great palm-leaf fan. "Oh dear," she sighed. "Do you suppose it's ever going to be cool again? It does seem as if I couldn't bear it any longer." "Aren't you well, darling?" inquired Katy anxiously. "Oh yes, well enough," replied Elsie. "It's only this horrid heat, and never going away to where it's cooler. I keep thinking about the country and wishing I were there feeling the wind blow. I wonder if Papa wouldn't let John and me go to Conic's section and see Mrs. Worrett. Do you think he would if you asked him?" "But," said Katy, amazed, "Conic's section isn't exactly country, you know. It is just out of the city, only 6 miles from here. And Mrs. Worrett's house is close to the road, Papa said. Do you think you'd like it, dear? It can't be very much cooler than this." "Oh yes, it can," rejoined Elsie in a tone which was a little fretful. "It's always cooler on a farm. There's more room for the wind, and, oh, everything's pleasanter. You can't think how tired I am of this hot house. Last night I hardly slept at all, and when I did I dreamed that I was a loaf of brown bread and Debbie was putting me into the oven to bake. It was a horrid dream. I was so glad to wake up. Won't you ask Papa if we may go, Katy?" "Why, of course I will, if you wish it so much. Only—" Katy stopped and did not finish her sentence. A vision of fat Mrs. Worrett had risen before her, and she could not help doubting if Elsie would find the farm as pleasant as she expected. But sometimes the truest kindness is in giving people their own unwise way, and Elsie's eyes looked so wistful that Katy had no heart to argue or refuse. Dr. Carr looked doubtful when the plan was proposed to him. "It's too hot," he said. "I don't believe the girls will like it." "Oh, yes, we will, Papa, indeed we will," pleaded Elsie and John, who had lingered near the door to learn the fate of their request. Dr. Carr smiled at the imploring faces, but he looked a little quizzical. "Very well," he said, "you may go. Mr. Worrett is coming into town tomorrow on some bank business. I'll send word by him, and in the afternoon, when it is cooler, Alexander can drive you out." "Goody, goody!" cried John, jumping up and down, while Elsie put her arms round Papa's neck and gave him a hug. "And Thursday I'll send for you," he continued. "But, Papa," expostulated Elsie, "that's only 2 days. Mrs. Worrett said a week." "Yes, she said a week," chimed in John, "and she's got ever so many chickens, and I'm to feed 'em and chase 'em as much as I like. Only it's too hot to run much," she added reflectively. "You won't really send for us on Thursday, will you, Papa?" urged Elsie anxiously. "I'd like to stay ever and ever so long, but Mrs. Worrett said a week." "I shall send on Thursday," repeated Dr. Carr in a decided tone. Then, seeing that Elsie's lip was trembling and her eyes were full of tears, he continued, "Don't look so woeful, Pussy. Alexander shall drive out for you, but if you want to stay longer, you may send him back with a note to say what day you would like to have him come again. Will that do?" "Oh, yes," said Elsie, wiping her eyes. "That will do beautifully, Papa. Only it seems such a pity that Alexander should have to go twice when it's so hot, for we're perfectly sure to want to stay a week." Papa only laughed as he kissed her. All being settled, the children began to get ready. It was quite an excitement packing the bags and deciding what to take and what not to take. Elsie grew bright and gay with the bustle. Just to think of being in the country, the cool, green country, made her perfectly happy, she declared. The truth was, she was a little feverish and not quite well, and didn't know exactly how she felt or what she wanted. The drive out was pleasant, except that Alexander upset John's gravity and hurt Elsie's dignity very much by inquiring, as they left the gate, "Do the little misses know where it is they want to go?" Part of the way the road ran through woods. They were rather boggy woods, but the dense shade kept off the sun, and there was a spicy smell of evergreens and sweet fern. Elsie felt that the good time had fairly begun, and her spirits rose with every turn of the wheels. By and by they left the woods and came out again into the sunshine. The road was dusty, and so were the fields, and the ragged sheaves of cornstalks which dotted them here and there looked dusty too. Piles of dusty red apples lay on the grass under the orchard trees. Some cows going down a lane toward their milking shed mooed in a dispirited and thirsty way, which made the children feel thirsty also. "I want a drink of water awfully," said John. "Do you suppose it's much farther? How long will it be before we get to Mrs. Worrett's, Alexander?" "Most there, miss," replied Alexander laconically. Elsie put her head out of the carriage and looked eagerly around. Where was the delightful farm? She saw a big pumpkin-colored house by the roadside a little farther on, but surely that couldn't be it. Yes. Alexander drew up at the gate and jumped down to lift them out. It really was. The surprise quite took away her breath. She looked about. There were the woods, to be sure, but half a mile away across the fields. Near the house there were no trees at all, only some lilac bushes at one side. There was no green grass either. A gravel path took up the whole of the narrow front yard, and what with the blazing colour of the paint and the wide-awake look of the blindless windows, the house had somehow the air of standing on tiptoe, staring hard at something. The dust in the road, perhaps, for there seemed to be nothing to stare at. Elsie's heart sank indescribably as she and John got very slowly out of the carryall, and Alexander, putting his arm over the fence, rapped loudly at the front door. It was some minutes before the rap was answered. Then a heavy step was heard creaking through the hall, and somebody began fumbling at an obstinate bolt which would not move. Next, a voice which they recognized as Mrs. Worrett's called, "Isophinie! Isophinie! Come and see if you can open this door." "How funny," whispered Johnny, beginning to giggle. Isophinie seemed to be upstairs, for presently they heard her running down, after which a fresh rattle began at the obstinate bolt. But still the door did not open, and at length Mrs. Worrett put her lips to the keyhole and asked, "Who is it?" The voice sounded so hollow and ghostly that Elsie jumped as she answered, "It's I, Mrs. Worrett, Elsie Carr, and Johnny's here too." "Tsk, tsk, tsk," sounded from within, and then came a whispering, after which Mrs. Worrett put her mouth again to the keyhole and called out, Go round to the back, children. I can't make this door open anyway. It's swelled up with the damp."